So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find then the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then, prior of the Israelic lineage, then came the Ishmaelic lineage, where we understand the descendants of Ishmael in Arabia are going to be making the most important decisions after the Chinese system is implemented. So then, rather than having other studies, let's then focus in what then Yohanan, the great Shaliach, has explained, as he was from the day one with the Messiah until his ascension, until the time of transition, and from the time of the Galah or revelation, then Yohanan was the last person closing then the instructions. So then let's evaluate from the viewpoint of Yohanan. So then we understand time of restoration, we must be absolutely certain where then we find there is no news. Absolutely 100% precisely no news. Any kind of information improving tabernacling would not be proper. Whatsoever was then done in the past is then simply re-established. So then, from this viewpoint, then we shift then from Yohanan then to Daniel. Why do we do this? Because Yohanan, he explained in the 8th chapter then the third part of the ships. He explains then this country around this area where the third part of the ships is at, a section of the world where then trade is taking place. As we understand, in a secular level of gentile rulership, you have to link then Daniel and Galah, Revelation. Have this in mind. Daniel the prophet also gave many understandings of tabernacling, though he was in exile because the nation of Israel did not maintain the yearly Shabbat. That's why then the Creator said, make sure during this span of time, make sure you have then the land rested. The land never rested in 490 years. So then whatsoever the Creator mentioned should be done. So then the nation went to exile so the land could rest. So then Daniel was found then in exile, and he wrote many words, many prophecies related with the time of the end. And from a statesperson viewpoint, doing trade from country to country, we understand precisely what Daniel was speaking of. As a tradesperson, he received the understanding from heaven, and he said at the end, nations then would try to come together and adhere to each other, but they would not. Then also he said knowledge would increase, and then people would go to and fro. There are sections of this area. He is explaining a time of the end related in part with the time of deceit, because to and fro means confusion. So he relates Gentile-wise, speaking of this time. He also relates knowledge would increase. Then we read the Messiah in the 24th chapter explaining of the time of the end. Though tabernacling would be then re-established during the troublesome times, but fear not, because the end is not yet. So then we have quite a few areas of evaluation. You have then the Messiah speaking tabernacling. We have then Daniel is speaking of tabernacling earlier and later Gentile level. He's explaining then Gentile level going to and fro. Then he explains the time of lots of knowledge related with Gentile level. So then, as we then understand Yeshayahu, the time of restoration, you can't have to and fro and have restoration, can you? You can't have to and fro confusion while restoring, because the prophecy of Yeshayahu includes Gentiles and also tabernacling at the same time. For those understanding, the entire understanding of the scripture must able then delineate what it is and what's not. So then, at the end, Daniel the prophet was explaining, going to and fro. What you can understand of going to and fro is time of deceit. Then we have to search then Daniel further, because when you understand then time of restoration, it can't be to and fro anymore or roaming around. The Italic lineage, from a translation of word by word of the Aramaic, explains roaming rather than going to and fro. However, when you understand the prophecy of Yeshayahu, explains very simply, then the cities would laid waste for many centuries, would then be reconstructed or then rebuilt, and the Gentiles would take care of their vineyards and their flocks. Speaks of organization. So when you read then Daniel explained, and then at the end the knowledge would increase and people would go to and fro. He's explaining the time of deceit. He's a prophet speaking of a Gentile level. So when you read the prophecy, the translation from the original manuscripts, from the vision while he had those dreams, has to be in sequence. Must come first then in a period of time. A period of time of Gentile would then be to and fro time of deceit. So you can easily understand 20th chapter of Revelation or Galah. What does it state? 1,000 years of the deceit and 1,000 years of the Messiah. First comes 1,000 years of the Messiah when he was born as a king. Then the cities came, then in 1009 or then 6009, destruction of the city of Jerusalem plus the tomb from where the Messiah came from after his death experience. So then after 6009, no more directives. There were no more cities. They couldn't give directives. People were going to and fro. So when we read Daniel, then he explaining the time of deceit. To and fro means deceit. After 7009 or 2009, then the time of going to and fro is gone. Then we are returning to the truth, Yeshayahu the 61st, where then you find the prophecy of Yeshayahu explaining the amazingly works of the Creator, and including tabernacling of the second tabernacle services, the cities laid waste. Plural, cities. Cities. Then later, you find the restoration. When you are restoring, you can't have confusion. So then, obviously, Daniel had covered the area of the 1,000 years of deceit. But then, he was explaining of a turning point, of a transitional time at the end of going to and fro. So first, when you translate from Daniel, and at the end of the time of deceit, a time of lack of directive, or then at the end of the time of roaming, or at the end of the time of going to and fro, then knowledge would increase. Because he is not speaking of the time of the end per se, because it would relate with tabernacling. He's not speaking of tabernacling, he's speaking of Gentile level. Why do we understand the Gentile level? Because you can't mix then iron with clay. What is he explaining? People then going to and fro, and knowledge would increase, explaining of the time of deceit, the ending of the time of deceit with increasing of knowledge. What do we understand the next step? We have then to retrieve ourselves from this understanding, and earlier when he had the vision of the statue. What was the purpose of the statue? Indicating each metal section of the statue was a country in charge. So then we understand what he meant. But then at the end, nations would come together and they would try to adhere to each other, but they would not. Some of them as iron, some of them clay. However, we find during this time Daniel already pointing a time where the Gentiles would experience high knowledge. And most importantly, we did not record the second section of the last vision of Daniel. It's lacking. There are manuscripts around with extra writings of the prophet Daniel. It's lacking a piece of it. Daniel would never fail to mention then the time of the great system. So it's lacking. Prior of the angel then saying, shut up the words and leave for the end. Because Daniel already had that stare face, a glance at the angel with that huge question mark on his face, wanting the angel to explain. The angel said, no, close the understanding because it's for the time of the end. It's lacking a piece. You have to understand then the context. What are we speaking of? We are speaking of a system. Do we understand the system from the viewpoint of Yohanan? Yes, we do understand, because Yohanan mentioned the area of the world with third part of the ships. It's a worldwide system. Daniel the prophet, he then explained the head of gold, and then the silver, and then the bronze, and so on and so forth. Do you think Daniel would leave aside this very particular nation in charge of the trade of the end? No. The manuscript is lacking. There is an understanding somewhere lost amongst the original manuscript, not translated properly. More than likely because the translators did not know what it meant. So they did not include it in the scripture. An example, Macabeus. The understanding of Macabeus, the first and the second chapter. Macabeus, you find then Yirmiyahu the prophet. You find Yirmiyahu going into the temple, activating the elevator system, and then protecting the holy objects. Do we not? Do we find this in the regular scripture? No, the translators did not understand. Somewhere along the world you have to find extra understanding of Daniel the prophet. In these manuscripts you find then extras. The translators didn't know what it was. As during the time of Yirmiyahu, the people of the law of his time did not understand what he was talking about. It's going to have a tabernacle in the future, and this tabernacle in the future would be El, would be then plural. And this tabernacle then would have a strange force coming from Elohim, and they would function amongst the nations. And the people of the law, what? And he was speaking specific words in Hebrew. And the name of these is such and such, and such and such, and he was speaking names. They did not have any clue. Not even the spring feast was completed. The time, more than likely, the leaders of the law, being so bad as they were, they didn't understand they were shadow prophetic. So then, when we read Daniel, we have to find the rest of it. Yes, Daniel said then at the end would be countries like iron and clay, but Daniel always pointed to the nation leading the system in a period of time. It's lacking. Where we find Yohanan, so meaning Daniel had the understanding, because he had the entire understanding until the time of the end. So it's lacking. Somewhere along the line, the translators, they did not understand, they did not include. So he must find it. So then, we understand China is this country then generating the bulk of the trade around the world. We understand this system is coming. Can there be another system worldwide? That's the main question. Let's understand the statue of Daniel. Daniel then, he was there. Why then has the Creator decided to show him a statue? As we understand, he was a statesperson. He was then dealing with a pagan system, Babylonian system. He was far away from tabernacling, though he had the very strong concept because of the manuscripts of Yirmiyahu. So he did understand tabernacling. But then we find then Daniel coming out of his work environment after a very tough day, dealing with scoundrels every time. Then he was worn out. He wanted to take a walk and, get himself refreshed. And his custom was going to the river. He would take a walk far away then, and then he would stay at the bank of the river. There he would lean around, and then he would take a nap. While he was doing this, he was receiving visions via dreams. Since we understand a consistency of the nations and then trade, nations and trade, nations and trade, do you think there is another system simultaneous with the Chinese system? No. You can't. This means the Eurozone is going to break. He can't have two systems. He has only a system. The Chinese system, worldwide, and nations are going to do trade with this singular particular system. No other nation is going to have a similar system from country to country. When the Chinese people, they are ready for the system, nations are going to log on instantly. You know why? Because trade is very inexpensive over there. You can get products from China, decent products, for around 10, freight at no charge. Try to order another part of the world the same part. You have to pay at least twice or then much more for freight than you pay for the product. But then, oh, come on, you can't think this way because it's so non-relevant. Oh, okay, so let's buy then electronics, flux, liquid, or paste. You go online, you find a Chinese provider, you get for maybe 5 for a nice size container of flux paste. So then you can do electronic work. You pay 5 for it, freight no charge. Do you know how much cost the Chinese system to provide you these 5 with freight at no charge? You think it's not relevant because you are speaking from the other side of the line. When you come to a point where our industry can provide the same product for then, rather than 5, 4 and no freight to go to China, then you are speaking the same level terms. This is what our government doesn't understand. They have taken for granted years of extraneous and then very serious work of the Chinese to get these 5 value of a product, and then it comes from the other side of the world at no charge. So then when the Chinese system comes, and then people download on the computer, do you think they are going to compete with any other system? The answer is given only explaining the fact itself. The Eurozone won't last for very long. It's going to break. So then we can expect for the next 36 months lots of worldwide changes. Because when the time comes, when the creator releases his finger from the project, then the world changes overnight. You're going to download in your own computer and you are online worldwide. And then the other countries, with their own linking up of their own system, won't survive. Because your banking, your financial private system is linked with the Chinese system, and you receive funding from the same via of a purchase. It is absolutely hugely profitable. The other system is going to break. The only section of it going for them is taxation at real time when there is earning. It's the only way they can survive. But as far as linking up nations with nations, forget it. It won't have it. Each nation must have its own system. And they have to be independent. However, they are linked with this Chinese system from country to country. And then when these nations they come out of poverty, obviously they are going to Arabia. That's where the new decision making of gentile level is going to be at. Why? Because they are the sons of Ishmael. Time of restoration. During the time of Egypt, there were not very many directives back then. Why? Because tabernacle service wasn't instituted. That's why we had Egypt, you have some other nations over there, pagan, they were prosperous. Because the Creator gave them a slack. That's why they prospered, though they were evil. But then when the first tabernacle service came, then came organization. Then we are speaking of restoration period of both sides, tabernacle and Gentile world. Because we are preparing ourselves for the autumn feast. So the system in Europe is going to break. There is absolutely certainty, 100%. Daniel, the statesperson, said, related with the Gentile level at the end, each nation to his own. They would try to come together, but they would not adhere to each other. What is he explaining? In terms of economics, they try to make this system to work amongst themselves, to kind of make it level, but then they would not adhere to each other. They have to remain individuals. But then when we link up with Yohanan, you understand the third part of the ships and then the nation leading the market of the end Daniel spoke of. Yohanan was mostly strictly tabernacling. However, he gave areas of layers of Gentile level where you find a completion. Daniel was the statesperson. So there are documents out there somewhere where then Daniel explains it. When we begin to update the scriptures, then we should include Macabeus, because linked up with Yirmiyahu the prophet regarding the temple must be included. Now we understand what it means. And then the extras of Daniel. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.